extraordinary amount of attention that was paid to the Conference of the Parties on Climate Change. It had so many heads of states. They had thousands of people representing various interest groups and delegates, and you had 24/7 coverage for the entire time that the conference was in play. And then the Conference of the Parties for the Convention on Biological Diversity, which was held in Nagoya, Japan, in October last year,
yes,
really received almost no attention, had very few heads of states attended,
right,
and was just not of the interest of the media and people. Of course, they don't have the kind of funding that the IPCC does. But it is interesting. I think that somebody told me when we were at a meeting that you can study something really well if you can measure it. And when it comes to climate change, people are focused on the idea of measuring carbon.
Yep.
And so they know what it is they need to measure. But then you bring up biological diversity and you say, well, where's the equivalent thing to measure
yes,
like carbon?
Exactly.
And you give them an answer, well, you have to measure functional diversity. Or some people might say you have to measure taxonomic diversity. And they go away because it feels like, well, this is not a tractable problem. Even if you can tell them that the problem is very important in human well-being, especially for the 2 billion poor of the world, is very, very important, and especially for sustainable development, if you want to make sure that your environmental solutions are long-lasting and long-term, that biological diversity is really important. They just feel that they don't know what to do with it, so they go away. And that's
right,
that's not a good thing, but it is in fact the way we work.
Absolutely. And just to piggyback off that point a little bit, it seems like there's a pretty interesting but perplexing political economy issue subsumed into that whole thing where, yeah, there's this weird stereotyping thing that must go on that doesn't allow us to think of biodiversity the same way we do climate change, in addition to the measurement problem. As far as the measurement problem is concerned, and speaking from someone who is outside of, I guess, the ecological community proper, do you see any, let's put it this way, let me pose this just provocatively on purpose, do you see there being any agreement within the scientific community, the quote-unquote scientific community, about what the proper measurement, proper unit of measure of biodiversity is in the near future? Because as an economist, the first reaction is like you said, hey, until we can have an agreed-upon metric like carbon, it's so hard to do anything analytically moving forward.
Well, I think that it's interesting because when you consider that biological diversity is made up of different components,
right,
genetic diversity, taxonomic diversity, and functional diversity, all of those have very well developed ways of measuring and very good indices which can be used for those. So you would think that a metric for biological diversity, which would be some way of just combining those three. What puzzles me is that when you have, say, things in economics like the GDP or the Dow Jones or other sorts of indices that people use,
yeah,
many people don't necessarily understand what goes behind them.
That's a very
but
good
they've gotten
point.
used to using these indices as what they feel are metrics. And many people know that there are problems with these metrics, but we use them anyway.
Oh, so many problems,
And I
yeah.
also think that when you think about high-energy physics, that I think a lot of people do not necessarily have a good handle on what quantum mechanics are and what the what the debate between those who were studying quantum mechanics and Einstein might have been.
Right.
Yet somehow they've decided that the physicists know what they're doing and can say if we really need to build a large hadron collider, even at the risk of making a small black hole in the collider,
On planet
that
Earth,
they will
yeah.
fund it to the tune of billions of euros.
That's a really
And the
good
same
point,
thing
yeah.
about NASA projects. I mean, many people have decided that it's very interesting for NASA to pursue projects which are doing things like looking for extra solar system planets or exoplanets, or doing some of the other sorts of strange measurements that they want to do in the solar system, as well as looking at Earth. And the same thing with health scientists. I mean, I think that many people do not necessarily have a good enough background in biology to understand why a particular drug that the doctor is prescribing to you is going to do the job that it does.
Right.
And we usually allow that the doctor is an expert, is well-trained, has a good reputation, we hope, and that we've decided to entrust this person to help us make decisions. And if the doctor says, given your state of health, this drug or this procedure or this change in your diet or change in your lifestyle might be one that you might consider seriously pursuing, we then take that under advisement and react. the high energy physicists can tell us what they feel is the next big experiment that has to be done in physics in order for us to better understand some of these very, very esoteric problems in physics. I think very few people truly understand what the Big Bang was, or what space-time continuum is, or what black holes are.
Yeah.
But they've been convinced that physicists can tell them, where best to put our money. For some reason, when it comes to ecologists, and I put the blame, I think, on ecologists or on evolutionary biologists, all of us, that we somehow haven't managed to get the public to recognize that we are a body of scientists, like the body of scientists who work in the IPCC, that can actually provide them with some information or advice about what the best thing is to do, and give them some indices and some things to measure, which may not be so easy to understand. I don't think the public necessarily knows exactly what the GDP is, but they know that it's used and they see it in the newspaper.
Yeah.
And if I said, well, you may not actually understand what this particular index of functional diversity is, especially since it's a very complex equation and has maybe a dozen different terms in it, but if you ask all of the scientists who study functional diversity, they've agreed upon this index as a good metric, so why don't you use it? We have to build up enough confidence in the public that we are the experts who can provide them with useful advice, much the way a doctor, as an expert, can provide you with useful advice about your health.
That's very, very interesting. I wish we had more time to go into more depth on that. One last question on this issue. Professor, do you think there's any element of institutional lock-in here? I mean, in terms of being biased toward the species concept of biodiversity?
I think there is a divide.
Okay.
I just came from a conference at the New York Botanical Garden, which involved many people at museums and at gardens. And they are very, very concerned with trying to do a global assessment or census of life on Earth. And there have been a number of programs which have done this. I think the census of marine life was recently completed, and they found lots of new species and lots of interesting things about the kinds of species you find in the oceans, which had never been done before. And they were in the news quite a bit every time they'd find some new interesting species in marine life. And I think people are fascinated with marine life. And then you wind up having the ecologists and conservation biologists who are much more concerned about saving ecological systems and the species within them. And in many cases, I think most of conservation biology these days is convincing people that conservation is good for their well-being. It's not just about the species, but it's about the well-being of the people who live in the vicinity of those species.
Right.
Whether it's for developing ecotourism or because they actually will provide some, utility in making their forests healthy and stable, or controlling the spread of pathogens, or pollinating their crops. We usually sort of tie conservation biologists and ecologists these days mostly try to tie the utility of the natural world to the people that live within it and live close to it. It would be a hard sell in Manhattan, as you know. I mean, after all, I live on top of a store in Manhattan, not far from Columbia University, where I have strawberries available to me every single day of the year, any time, morning or night, because the store is open 24/7.
Yes.
And that gives you a very perverse realization about what life is like. Strawberries do not grow 24/7 in Manhattan, even if you can buy them in Manhattan 24/7. So I think these institutional divides, and I think you picked on a very important point, are going to be hard to separate, but that doesn't mean that both missions aren't important. I think that the same way we do a census every 10 years in the United States, because we know it's important to count the people that are there, and to ask them some basic questions about their lives, is very, very important. And that's what museums and gardens and zoos are very good at. But then the converse of that, which would be to try to do surveys about people's health, their well-being, their income, their aspirations, their political opinions, their social ideologies and so forth, which are done through many other institutions and many other sort of survey mechanisms, well, that has to be in place for biological diversity as well, where we find out more about what species do, how well they do the job, do they do the job reliably, are they being impacted by climate change, ocean acidification, habitat fragmentation, increasing fire frequency, and many, many other things. We need to learn about not just who's there, but how well they're doing and how well they're able to carry out the functions that they're very good at doing. The only thing is that if a census taker were to walk up to a resplendent quetzal or to an elephant or to a sea otter, it would be probably hard to get any information from them. They can get information from people.
Other than some pretty pictures, I guess. I think that's very well put. If you don't mind, let's jump tracks a bit and transition into the last segment of the show. So this is where I like to ask all of our guests to give us your top three, either books or authors or papers. All of this in the spirit of sharing ideas and sort of where you get your personal inspiration from.
Well, gee, I read so much, it's hard for me, and I never ask, like, is this better or worse? I will tell you that a book I read recently is something called Rare Earth.
Okay.
And it's by people who would call themselves astrobiologists. And it's Peter Ward and Donald Brownlee are the authors of it. Okay. And now it's a very unusual book because it talks about the birth and death of planet Earth. It doesn't talk too much about people, but it gives you a really good sense about how unique and fragile our planet is, but not from an environmental perspective, but more from a scientific perspective. Huh. Because their argument is that life is extremely rare, except for maybe microorganisms, in our galaxy, if not in the universe. And people have it all wrong, that in fact life is not common in the universe. And I really enjoyed reading that book, I guess because it was different from the usual sorts of books that I wind up reading.
Yeah,
I think certainly E.O. Wilson's book on consilience has been something that many of us have wound up rethinking about the philosophy of science. And I found it a little harder to read than some of the other books that he has written. And,
I agree with you on that.
On the science books that I've read as opposed to, say, novels and so forth, and whenever I get time to do something like that. And then there's a very simple book which is called What is Biodiversity? And you'll notice that I do read books on conservation and environmental issues, things about water shortage and environmental ethic and so forth. But as a scientist, I tend to get attracted to the books that speak more to the questions that I struggle with as a scientist from day to day. There's a book by James McLaren and Kim Stern, which is called What is Biodiversity? I will admit that I found this book hard to read. I can't tell you how many people saw me reading this book, because I use the Kindle a lot these days, but I had this as a real book in my hand, and they would see, this professor of biological diversity reading a book called What is Biodiversity? And wondering, like, what are his credentials if he's still trying to figure out what this thing is?
Let me rethink my major choice.
Well, I have to tell you that, if a student came to visit me during office hours because of a class I was teaching on biological diversity, and I had this book on top of my desk, they would really wonder, like, is he just boning up now for a class he actually doesn't know very much about? Actually, professors do a lot of that. But what's interesting is that they are trying to say that biological diversity is something even more complex than what people have described it now. They believe that we have to include the sort of developmental diversity and phylogenetic diversity into our ideas of biological diversity more so than just plain taxonomy and functional diversity and genetic diversity. Developmental diversity is interesting because organisms go from single cells, as you and I have done, to these very complex organisms. But the ways they do that are really quite different and quite extraordinary and actually constrain the kinds of species that we see evolving over time and represent a clear sort of shaping force in the biological diversity that surrounds us. But it was a hard book to read, even though it was short. But I think, in the last couple of years, I would say of the many books and papers I've read, I've been influenced by that. There are lots of good papers that I've read, but, papers tend to focus on a single aspect of a single topic.
Sure.
And I find I get a lot more out of books. It's just they take a lot longer to read. It's hard to get through them.
Well, great. So for all of our listeners, we'll put links up to all three of these and any other books and reports mentioned in this podcast on our website, which is senseandsustainability.net. I guess one last question I have for you, Professor, is for any of those, speaking of major choice, for any of the aspiring ecologists or environmental scientists who are listening, be that high school students or undergrads or graduate students, could you maybe tell us a little bit about what you see being the important or hot, quote-unquote, research topics of the next decade or two? I know we touched a little bit on some of the potential ones in the podcast, but if you could just kind of reiterate them.
Well, I think that the great thing about biological diversity is it's very all-encompassing about many, many factors of the natural world.